So this weekend was interesting weekend, right? We're in October, and we're picking like goddamn crazy. We're like 75% of the way through the harvest. And so I on Sunday morning on my way to Novato, like going through Carneros, dude, I could not believe the amount of rain. We were expected to get like, I don't know, a tenth, maybe 0.2, like a quarter of an inch. We got like a half inch in some areas in the interior, and then we got like over an inch in some areas like on the far coast, like way more than I expected. It was fucking downpouring like 8:30 yesterday morning. That was Sunday. But, you know, the end of the season is here. Now it's just hang time. Now we're just chilling. Now we're just picking. As we got tank space, it's open. So I think we got like 2 more weeks. So there's your harvest update, everyone. And welcome to Go With Your Palate, where you got me, Joe Wagner, and Chris Fat Mario Rubio talking about wine.
Are you okay?
What?
So with Halloween, dude.
Halloween brings on kind of the end of harvest vibe. We had this rain last night. It was great.
But it's not going to be end of harvest, right?
Well, this year's a really late year.
Just this year,
but I mean, that's like the vibe. Like, you know,
yeah,
everything is kind of sitting out there, just waiting to be picked now. Like, there's nothing more we can do in the season to really affect sugar ripeness, which is fine, but a little more hang time, given that the weather holds up. Like, yeah, we're good. But if we got to pick everything off, if another rain comes, we'll be like, pick it all off and bring it all in. But right now it's just like the chill waiting time, and then this is when fruit becomes amazing.
Yeah.
So but I think we're gonna be like all done in about 2 weeks, because like I don't think it's gonna, like, once we get into November, it's like, come on, dude, the days are super short. You're not getting much out of that, and you're gonna be risking some like rot and mildew issues, that sort of thing. So we'll probably get it all picked off. But Halloween is kind of that moment, like that day where it's like, yeah, we're still working. We still got fermenters going. In this case, this year, we're still harvesting. But there's just like this thing, at least a trigger in my mind, like every year, where it's like, oh, Halloween's here. Like, we're about to wind down. And then you have kind of this, you know, once, say, mid to late November rolls around and everything's rested to barrel, you're like, oh, this is, you know, another harvest behind us. Fucking hell yeah. Dude. And then it becomes kind of chill for, you know, maybe like December. And then January, we pick back up pretty heavy.
Yeah, and so with
not in sales though. The sales guys, if you sales guys and girls are listening to this, guys are working your asses off in October, November, December. You guys know it. This is where you bring the bacon home, baby.
Yeah, that's how you. Yeah, you come in with. You always have like the good like fucking Braveheart speeches and stuff like that. We should get a video of that, like something from NSM or something, like where you're just like yelling at them, or the videos that you make. It's just always so much fun, dude. You get them going. But there was a question though. So like something like what just happened with the heavy rain and everything, just to clarify that, like, what that was. You said it was a lot more rain than you expected. When something like that happens, you're concerned about watching out for the fruit hanging and mildew issues.
Yeah. So like, I don't have any issues here, like say in Napa, and we're like done with the Central Coast, and Central Coast didn't really get the weather either. So it's really just at this point the North Coast. So say Sonoma and Napa counties.
Yes.
So a little bit of Pinot still out there, and then quite a bit of Cab still out there. Yeah. But the Cab is good to hang. So like Cab can handle more rain than Pinot. But like our most coastal vineyard, like the coldest vineyard that we farm, is Taylor Lane. One of my favorites, like first vineyard I ever planted.
One of my favorites too.
And it's gorgeous out there. I was out there last week, and like, dude, it was, I mean, I saw like some little spots of botrytis popping up, like which isn't like a bad thing. Like, we expect it in areas like that are really marginal, really cool, and like especially when you have like a little moisture, a little heat, little moisture, a little heat, and so a little bit popping up, and so we were like, all right, well, last week, like warm, dry weather, it was really good, like we needed last week, and we're like, okay, well, fuck it, don't worry about like trying to correct it or anything. We don't want to like do something dumb like spray it. So let's just let that heat do its thing and that dryness do its thing, and then we'll come in and pick it. So got a little more rain. We got like an inch out there, so, which is a lot of rain for Pinot to go through. It'll be fine, and it's cool now, so we're probably going to get that on the schedule for as soon as we can get a tractor in there to pick. I mean, it's all hand-picked, but you got to have a tractor to carry like the bins behind it and whatever else when you're picking. So we'll probably pick that, I'd say, Thursday or Friday this week, and that'll pretty much, you know, end our Pinot harvest this year. But I mean, it's looking good, and nice. But yeah, I mean, I'm not worried about it. Like 2011 was a really rough vintage because we had rain it was like every 5 days we'd have like a system come in, and it'd be more rain than we wanted. So you'd be like, okay, we're looking at, an inch and a half at a time, and we actually started to see like just berries like falling off the fucking cluster on the vine. You'd go up and like shake it, shake the vine, and it just rained down berries. Like, this is not good. This is not good. Okay. That was a rough year.
When you grab it and you're shaking it and the berries are falling down, you're like, that's not good. What is happening to it?
You actually have some sort of fungus or mildew that has degraded the connection of the stem to the berry. So it's like, if you ever eat table grapes, like just pop one of those things off, right?
Yep.
You pull it off, and from that stem, what we call the peduncle, that's the...
Peduncle.
It's like one of my favorite words.
Shit.
Peduncle. I think we've talked about that on the podcast before.
We did? We talked about peduncle?
But when you pull that off, the peduncle is the pedunkadunk.
Oh, we did.
You got that Sonoma Coast peduncle. Something like that, right?
Okay,
I think it was Trace Adkins saying that.
Shake it. Oh.
So you pull it off, and you'll see that there's like part of that stem that extends into the berry itself and has a little bit of meat on it from the fruit. And so that's the connection. That's what's holding that berry on. And so in like 2011, that was so compromised that that connection was just not there. So like that peduncle and that connection to the berry was actually severed off by some sort of a rotting that was occurring, and it would just drop off. So, so a stem is actually called a rachis, and there is the peduncle. If we're getting technical about the terms, the cane is the shoot. Yes, thank you, Art. It's a nice little thing. Anyway, so yeah, that's it. I'm not too worried about the rain. It's going to be nice and clear for the next couple of weeks, and we'll get it all off to the fucking wines this year are off the hook.
Hell yeah.
They're like
it's going to be
super dark reds. Everything's very expressive. Everything's just like, it's giving. Like when you get something in a fermenter and you're just smelling it and tasting it, like, this is good. Everything's good. Like, what the hell is good? Like it's turned out to be, I bet you this year, while we were all worried about it, thinking that it was going to be challenging, it's the late spring, I bet you this is going to go down in the history books. 2023 is one of the best vintages in the last 100 years.
Yeah. Hell yeah.
That's what I truly, and I'm not just saying that to like market this stuff.
No.
Because by the time the wines come out, nobody's going to fucking remember this podcast anyways.
Yeah.
This episode. We're going to be fucking huge though, as far as the podcast goes. So. But
they'll go back.
But when 2023 comes out, nobody's going to go back and be like, I remember Joe talking about this being the vintage of the century or the vintage of the last 100 years. Like, dude, it's a good one.
Yeah. Well, I love it that we've had the past podcast where you're just like, well, I mean, so there was like 2011 and 97. Those were like the hard years with a good, I mean, when you just call out vintages like years and stuff like that, and you know how the weather was that year and everything, it's actually kind of amazing, dude. So harvest update. That was a big point of the
let's jump into a harvest update, because this is a funky year. It's if somebody's listening to this 5 years down the road, we are in the vintage of 2023.
Yes.
And it is, mid-October, and we literally just started picking. Like, we are so far behind an average schedule. So why is that? Well, we had a lot of water this last winter.
Yes.
And it was a pretty wet spring, pretty cold spring. Yep. The vines were slow and late to wake up. So, that kind of sets us already on a course for being a later harvest. Then we had a very cool year overall. I mean, it was, but there were some really weird things that we saw out in the vineyard. An example would be like, we always wait for copper cane, that full lignification of that cane, right, so that like all of the green is kind of purged out of the vine and the wine. And so I was down at a vineyard in Monterey, and this is the first place I saw it. So we were going through veraison, and that's where you start to see like sugar distribution to the berries. You start to see some color get into the berries as well. And usually that's about the time that you start to see the beginning of that copper cane at the very base of the cane, and then slowly migrates up to the very tip. So we're going through veraison. I'm looking at these vines, and like the lower leaves are already yellowing, like they're going into fall. Like, this is the very beginning of the ripening process, and it's almost fully lignified. Like, we're almost full copper cane, right? And we got like, 5 bricks or something like that. Usually we pick 25 or more bricks, right? So I'm like, oh, this is going to be a weird fucking year. So then we were monitoring, we're tasting. The funny thing that happened, or started to happen, and we noted it in maybe 3 weeks ago or so, was that our acids were actually dropping pretty heavily, which is Like that was not expected. Acids were remaining really high, and pHs were climbing, while the sugars were still low. So we're like 22 bricks. We started picking shit at like 24, 23 and a half because it was ripe and ready to go. And those wines, like they're already almost done with fermentation. They taste great. Then we had this massive heat spike down in the Central Coast, what we call the Santa Ana winds coming from inland.
Yeah.
And it's like a fucking like oven. And so hottest place, I think it was last Friday, hottest place in the United States was Santa Maria Valley at 107 degrees. And
Holy shit. I had no idea it got that hot.
It was fucking hot.
When was this, you said?
Last Friday.
Last Friday? It was 107 there in Santa Maria?
We picked all through the weekend, and then a cooling spell started. So we're still picking like crazy right now.
Holy moly.
But that just kind of like popped everything up. And I'm not kidding. Like we went from, in some cases, like 24 bricks to 28 within like 2 days. Like that's a huge jump. So you gotta think like you're in a furnace and these grapes are like, they're on the cusp of being ripe. And then all of a sudden you get this heat wave come through and it just concentrates everything. So those wines are actually turning out really good too. We like still have those in tank, just started fermentation on some of those. Overall, I'd say it's a very late year. We got good weather ahead. I think we're gonna be picking into November, which is not a bad thing if the weather holds out. We had like, a little teeny tiny bit of rain like early on this week, and then that kind of cooled everything down. So we're seeing now like a separation between what the early picked stuff and what was ready early, or earlier, relatively speaking, versus what's going to come in next, which will be mostly cab. So we want this separation so that, we can focus on the Pinots, and then once we finish those, we can get those in barrel and then focus on the cabs. So not a bad vintage, a funky vintage. Like it'll be one that goes down as kind of like, there's some weird anomalies that have occurred that I've never seen in my 20-plus year career. 2011 was probably the closest. Yeah. But 2011 ended with like just rain upon rain, like all through October. It was wet. We had berries literally just falling off the vine. You'd like shake the vine, like hit it, and it would rain down berries because you started getting mildew issues. And it was eating the union, what we call the peduncle. And that's a really sexy word, peduncle.
Oh, dude, I gotta. I'm sorry, I gotta just write that one down.
But like if
pedunkadunk.
So if you buy like table grapes, right, and you pull one of those table grapes off the stem, you'll see that there's like a shaft that was going into the grape itself that was holding the grape to the stem.
Shaft that goes into the grape itself.
And so it was eating that part of it, so the berries would just fall right off the vine. So it was the messiest, hardest harvest I've ever had. So this is like 2011. But with a happy ending. Like that's what it's shaping up to be. And 2011
2011 goes down in the books as your the hardest harvest
for me,
for you that you experienced.
Yeah. Pinots were awesome in 2011. Cabs were a huge challenge because we just didn't get like the pyrazines. It was so underripe, and you're picking when you can and stuff. And those wines turned out to be really good, like age-worthy wines, but at the moment when you're tasting them, you're like, yeah, there's something missing. They just weren't like full and rich and forward. So they've aged really well, and you can go back to like 98, the 98 vintage, also being a pretty cool year. And people like wrote that vintage off. They're like, garbage vintage, don't even buy it. Well, the people that bought into it and cellared it, like those wines started to just catch fire like 10 years after they were bottled. And they're still tasting good. They hold up like. And then 97, sorry, I'm like getting all into these.
No, but it's actually cool that you have all this like in your fucking noggin, dude. Like,
so 97 was a big vintage and a really warm one. So you had like everything was super forward. It was on full display, super showy wines, and everybody was like lauding them, just like, oh my God, this is the vintage of the century. And the wines were phenomenal, but they fucking fell apart within, a couple years of bottle aging. So it's funny to like, depending on what is it you're going for when you're making a wine. And if you're the one saying like, well, I want to grow in a region that's going to make wines like 2011, like 2023, that are going to be age-worthy for a long period of time, but really don't hit their stride until they've been bottle aged for, a good, almost decade or more. Or do you want to find a balance between those two, or do you want to be full, like fruit forward? Like it kind of partly is a decision, but then the decision relies upon where you grow the grapes. So are you growing them in a warm climate, or are you growing them in a cooler climate, like something that's just barely above the threshold of maturity? So all that stuff plays a role. But I mean, overall, like 2023, I think it's going to be a real, like the color coming out of these grapes is like, it is dark. And I went through, we smell our tanks on a daily basis. So I went through and like, even this morning, like, holy shit, these like ferments taste or smell phenomenal. Like you go through, we smell the tanks multiple times a day looking for any flaws or any sulfite issues that might be arising or whatever it might be. But overall, we're smelling through and it's just like dark fruit, richness, meatiness, just vibrant. Like the colors are bright purple. You're like, this is looking really good. And the first wines that have come out of fermentation are looking really good too. And the whites are good too.
And when you said like the color is really dark, so that's something that obviously that you're looking for the darker, like the darker the color, you're thinking is like the better. Like,
just
where's the connection with that?
So like overall, like as you get through vintages and everything, you'll have challenges every vintage. But like when we're picking, like obviously we're out in the field, we're checking the sample or checking the blocks, tasting them, like macerating the skins to see what kind of color uptake we're getting or how much is coming out. But then once we get it in the winery, like once you're starting fermentation, once you get it in a tank, so like take Pinot Noir, you can tell within a day. You're like, oh, it's kind of milky, it's lighter, it's kind of pink, or it's like this is just bleeding color, and that tells you that they're like whatever happened this year. Because I was really concerned when I saw that first vineyard like going through veration. Yeah, I was like, this is not normal. This could be like a really bad thing, in the sense of like, are we going to be picking at a low level of like sugar maturity because we're already at physiological maturity, and is that going to sacrifice some of the color? Well, it turns out that no, that wasn't the case. Whatever the hell the vines did, whatever Mother Nature gave them in the last like month, they're dark as shit.
And you're still like going with your philosophy of, I know you like to like have a little more hang time. Oh yeah, every year, right? So you still keep that consistent. Oh yeah. No matter what is happening with Mother Nature every year, you're still looking for that late hang time in those dimples. I
think the extended hang time is just a byproduct of our core philosophy of when to pick, right? So like, it's not like we're saying, okay, everybody else is picking right now, so we got to wait 2 weeks. It's more like, okay, everybody's picking, like pretty normal. Where are we at? What do we think? Like, have we fully lignified off? Or the thing we were waiting on this year more than anything was the seeds. So it seemed like we had full copper cane, but the seeds still had some green streaks in them. So we're like, all right, well, let's wait. And then finally it was like, okay, tastes good, like numbers look good, like not everything's perfect, right? Like maybe it seemed like a little lower sugar than what we would typically do. Now, as we've waited and we got through that heat spike, and that's a little higher sugar than we usually do. But physiologically, like, they're ready. And so it just takes experience. Like every year you get accustomed to what you see, and you just kind of relate back to that. So like this year is a very dark year. We've only brought one pick of cab in so far. That was out in Woodin Valley. That was like a little, like, just like an experiment.
Oh yeah. So, sorry, because I heard something really interesting last week, and I want to touch on it too. So I believe the cab. You said you just brought in cab. Yeah. So I think for people that may not know, but there is a sort of timeline that we go through with harvest and different varietals and grapes. Yeah. So very generally, white comes first, red comes second.
Very generally, yeah.
And then if we're going to go down into the details of it, you can actually say what varietals. For example, if you're talking about reds, Pinot is going to come before Cabernet.
Yeah, so typically, and part of it does rely upon where you grow the fruit, right? But like, given that we know kind of Pinot Noir thrives in more cool, temperate coastal areas of California, Cabernet would be really green if you grew them in those areas. So Cabernet does better in like not too hot, but warm enough to get ripe, right? So like Napa, parts of Sonoma County, parts of the Central Coast like Paso, where you have these big swings. That's a big part of it. Daytime highs to nighttime lows. Yeah. But you're hitting like, say, an average of 90 degrees during the day. Whereas with Pinot Noir during like the summer months, we're probably hitting mid to high 70s, right? So just imagine that, right? Now you're growing grapes, and you could just say grapes are grapes are grapes are grapes. Well, Pinot Noir is an early season varietal, ripens really early. So if you look at reds, we're going to say, well, if we grew Cabernet and Pinot Noir side by side in Napa Valley, we'd probably pick Pinot Noir like a month before, maybe even 6 weeks before we even touch Cabernet, because it ripens that early. Now, you put it in a cool area, it still ripens early, but it does have the opportunity for hang time and development on the vine, and that's what we're looking for. So that's where you want that kind of like, you want to match the varietal with the right climate. So if I were to break it down by kind of like how our picks go, it starts off with sparkling, but that's more because we're picking that at a low level of sugar. That has nothing to do with copper cane. That's really all about like, you want to be 18, 19 bricks because you don't want the alcohol to be too high in sparkling. And it's a pretty simple process. And if you're like doing Pinot for a Blanc de Noir, you don't want it ripe. You don't want a lot of color to bleed out of that. So Blanc de Noir is like, you would think you're going to be getting like a rosé. Yeah. But that's not the case. You're getting like generally just clear, clean juice.
Yeah.
So start with sparkling, then we move into the lighter whites that ripen earlier, that we want to pick a little earlier too, like Sauvignon Blanc, Gewürztraminer, Albarino, some of those, but Sauv Blanc probably being like the biggest, most notable here in California. And then you'll jump into Pinot Noir being your first reds, and that'll follow up with maybe some of the Rhone varietals, Grenache, Syrah, and then as you move, and Zinfandel. And then as you move a little bit further into harvest, you start to see, depending on where your Chardonnay is grown, because Chardonnay here in Napa, like we started picking that, right about the same time we were picking Pinot on the Central Coast. But then we've also got some Chardonnay out in like Sonoma or down in Santa Maria, and those are in cooler climates, and so we haven't picked those yet. So then you'll have kind of like the call it the cleanup of the later season Chardonnays, and right about that same time your Cabs start to get ripe in Napa. So it kind of has this like even flow, generally speaking. And one of the things is like when you design a winery, you're looking at like how many turns of these fermentation tanks am I wanting to get? Some people will push and be like, if you're making like $2 chuck, you're gonna be like 6 to 7 turns, meaning you're using that tank 6 to 7 times. You're running through fermentations quick, just turn and burn, like 3, 4, 5 days. You crush, inoculate, do your fermentation, all automated, all that stuff, and you make a bunch of plonk. It's not like good stuff, but still it goes into some bottle that goes into a store and somebody buys it, and it could be
a bunch of plonk.
Plonk. I think it's a UK term actually. It means shitty liquid. So
I like it. I make it shitty liquid.
So for us, like we like to look at it more from say like a 2-turn perspective, right? Yeah. So we can slowly do our fermentations and really take our time and coax out all those characters. Pinot Noir is a pretty fast fermenter when you let it. So we do our cryo extraction and our cold fermentation, suppress that yeast from being overly vigorous and converting all that sugar to alcohol really fast. So we, instead of being like a 5 to 7 day period of active fermentation, we can get that to like 3 weeks and then add cold soak and whatever else on the front end. And so you end up having like, let's call it a month that you're going to be filling those tanks with predominantly Pinot. And then as Pinot Noir is winding down throughout the state from a picking perspective, Cabernet is just ramping up typically. And I'll relate this to 2023 in a minute. Yeah. But Cabernet is just ramping up typically. And that's going to spend probably 6 weeks, if not 8 weeks in tank. And so that's kind of like our last use of those tanks. And that works out perfect. Cab ferments slower. It also generally sees quite a bit more what we call extended maceration. So after primary ferment is done, there's no more sugar to ferment. Then we leave it on skins for a period of time, just trying to soften the tannins out. And that's really a taste thing. You just taste every day and you're like, ready to drain. No. And then maybe one day you're like, yeah, this is tasting on point. Let's drain it and get it in a barrel. So that's kind of how it is. Now, 2023, what was coming was that all of these early season varietals and like Pinot Noir being a big tranche for us. So we do a lot of Pinot.
Yeah.
So it was being pushed back. And then you're looking at, you're like, okay, well, if I need 4 weeks in a tank and we're going to be picking everything, say, finish up Pinot Noir by, I don't know, pick a date, say October 20th. And then add 4 weeks to that. That puts your next fill at like mid-November. And we usually don't pick into November.
Yeah.
So we're usually done picking by mid to late October. And then it's fermentation finish up. And then you're going to go, okay, now we're picking mid to late November. And we're going to be seeing, let's call it 8 weeks at the outside. So that puts you into the new year for when you're draining and pressing. And so it's kind of like everything's delayed. Just a funny dynamic. But what with this rain and this cool spell we are going through right now, it has separated things. But in a good way, because now we don't need to rush to pick off the cab. Now we're just kind of chilling, and we're like, okay, let's let it hang out there. It's getting better, tasting better. Not quite there. We're gonna start picking a little bit of cab next week, but and we've done one pick of cab in a very warm climate.
Which brings me back to so last week there was a situation, right, where you had a load of Chardonnay coming in, a load of Pinot Noir coming in, and a load of Cabernet coming in.
Yeah.
Which is, now would you say that's kind of not the norm of
that's not the norm. I mean, you might have a couple overlaps like that, but this year everything was getting really consolidated, and then you look at well, are we just gonna hold our breath and hope that we don't get rain? And that's kind of what we have to do right now. But dude, the forecast looks great. It looks really good.
It does. It's weird because there's still these heat spikes that are coming in, which I think is just next week it's gonna be high 80s.
Yeah.
What?
It's
we're still trying to experience fall. And I was gonna say too, I mean, when you say you do a lot of Pinot Noir, I mean you have your vineyards in Oregon.
Yeah.
So I was thinking too, with this season, you're also dealing with the different climates of these different states.
What was really weird about Oregon was it was a warm ass year up there. It was so California was cool. Oregon was riper than California Pinot. Oregon Pinot was ahead.
Whoa.
Which I've only been working in Oregon since 2012,
yeah.
But I've never seen Oregon Pinot Noir be ahead physiologically and sugar-wise over anything in California. So we actually started picking Oregon way earlier than we did California. I mean, Oregon's almost done.
Wow.
So and it's good. I mean, I'm no complaints. They did get a little rain up in the Willamette, but most of our stuff had already been picked off. But Pinot can weather maybe 2 storms, 2 real storms, depending on kind of what comes after that. If it's a storm and then hot weather, and then you have perfect scenarios for mildew to grow.
Yeah.
then it sucks. But Pinot can handle a couple of rains. Cabernet can handle 3, 4, depending on just I think what the dynamics are. But so once you see that, I mean, I'd like to say after one rain, if Pinot needs to hang out, don't risk it on the second, because it might it just might fall apart. And when Pinot falls apart, it falls apart really fast. It's a thin skin, and it just is a fucking mess.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going back to earlier in my career. I remember we had it might have been 2011, and Zinfandel's kind of similar to Pinot in that way. And we just weren't we were waiting and waiting and waiting on the Zin, and we had all this rain that had come in and just decimated the Zinfandel. So I remember we brought in one pick of Zinfandel that year, and when we were dumping the bins into the hopper, because so if everybody doesn't know, we pick the fruit, we bring it to the winery, we weigh it, and then we dump it into a hopper or a vessel that will feed into a destemmer, so we can knock all the berries off of the cluster, and the stems come out, those go into a compost pile, and then all of what we have the must now is what we call it, M-U-S-T, and that's your skin, pulp, seed, and juice. And that's what we're going to ferment. There you go. There's a picture of a receiving hopper, as we call it. Anyway, so we're dumping this in, and I'm what the fuck is this? There were clouds coming up. So just as it was hitting the hopper, it was clouds of mildew.
Oh shit.
And so we went ahead and fermented it, and we're this is it was a super funky fermentation. I think it was either 2010 or 2011. That one might have been 2010. And so we plated it, put it under a microscope, and you could actually see the mold, the mildew, the structure of the mildew under glass that was tightening everything up. It was almost like a spider web throughout all of the juice that was fermenting. It was all mildew. It was weird.
So then you weren't...
And it smelled moldy the whole time, the fermentation and the finished wine.
You weren't able to move forward with that then, I'm guessing.
No, we made it. We finished it. We drained it and pressed it, and it's not like that's not an issue that's going to, you're not inoculating the winery with something bad, right?
That's why I want to make that point too. Some people that might be oh, mildew.
And that goes everywhere and fucks up all the wine. No, it's just consolidated to that tank. Now, once we drained and pressed that, it looked like that, but it was just the whole fucking plate art.
You saw the picture?
And so we started running trials because like this is the fun part of like those challenging lots. So you're like, well, we're deeming this unsalvageable, so we're either going to destroy it or sell it, or let's experiment with it and try some new shit. So we started like running different filters for this, and it was plugging the shit out of filters because like it was like it hit your first plates and like capture whatever, then the next, and as it got down to a smaller size, you'd end up like plugging those too. But it was just all of that mildew, and the funny thing was once we got that out, the wine didn't taste like mold anymore. So it was just like, oh, that was literally just something that was like in the fruit. Once we figured out exactly how to filter it, then it worked out okay.
Yeah.
We didn't use that a lot, but still, it was like we learned like if we ever have a really like a worse than 2011 vintage, like, and there's mildew everywhere, I'm sure we'll go back into our books and be like, what did we do in 2011 or 2010 to figure this out, and then try to employ that and see if we can salvage something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty awesome for like perseverance of like the farmers, of like what you guys have to do every year. I think it's like I feel like it's somehow like some people might kind of like smile or something, that, you know, I feel like obviously when you come out of it, you're going to be like, this is going to be the greatest vintage every year. Not really. And then people will be like, oh, maybe there was like fires. Maybe there was like this excess of like cool climates or rains, or there was a pandemic, or there's like all this stuff that's like affecting the vines and everything like that. But it's what you guys have to do, because there's no answer of, did you ever have a year where you were like, we couldn't do it this year?
Like just
like, you know what I mean? Like it was too hard. Like, for example, you would just have to like keep adapting. And
you had, the funny thing was in the pandemic was like, you know, not only did we have the pandemic in 2020, which really like the ability to work as a team as we always had was decimated to a degree. Like, I mean, yeah, we were all essential and we were all kind of like in our pods. We created our like 6-person pods within. But it just was so fucking dumb. Like, we're like really like, hey, David, don't get closer than 10 feet, otherwise we'll get written up. You know, like, I mean, it was such dumb shit. Anyways, we so what happened that year? Not only was it the pandemic, which gave huge insecurities to wine producers, right? Especially if you're a small high-end producer in Napa Valley.
Yes.
So they're all like, well, I'm not selling my wine. Nobody can visit the wineries.
No.
So that was shut down. So if your business model is pretty much all direct or wine club, and how do you capture those wine club members? Well, they got to come to your winery, enjoy the wines, hear the story, buy into it, and then sign up for the wine club. So that was decimated. People were pulling back on their spending. So a lot of wine club members would drop off from these clubs, just thinking like, I got to, focus on what I really need to focus on right now, like this luxury product of wine. I don't need to spend $200 a bottle until we see which way is up. And then you had the fires on top of it in 2020. Now the fires gave the perfect excuse for anybody who wanted to take a vintage off to just be like, they would just call up their insurance and be like, yep, I'm pretty sure we got smoke damage. The crop is not salvageable, so we're just going to take a crop insurance claim. Honestly, I think that was all bullshit. We ran through 2020, and I mean, yeah, there were a few lots that had smoke damage that we didn't pick.
Yeah, I mean,
but the vast majority of the shit that was out in the field was good, and I mean, like, really good.
Yeah,
we made a great 2020 vintage in Napa. It's all sold through. Like, nobody even mentioned like, oh, this was the smoke taint vintage. Like, you guys had a fire. Because no, the wine didn't taste like it had any smoke taint.
You did bring up a good thing though about like vintages, and something to note that I saw with aging is that so if you were saying holding on to a bottle of wine, that like sometimes it's important to know what was going on that year to know how it's going to structurally hold up. Yeah. So like you're saying, if it was a 2011, which was, like known as like your hardest year. Yeah. That like a wine like that, the aging process is not going to hold up as well as a 97.
Opposite.
Or opposite.
Yeah. So the 11 and like 98 and 11 have been showing that they hold up better than those super ripe vintages. Oh. So like the 97 being a super ripe vintage, or even like you go to 04 or 06, like those were pretty damn ripe vintages. I'm not saying they don't hold up, but they just don't express themselves as well. They don't have like as much tension as they get older. They get a little flabby, overly soft, and so these kind of like lower maturity vintages, if you want to call it that, they tend to like maintain more tension, too much so in the beginning. Now, if you're a producer who's going to say like, I want to produce a wine like that needs to be aged for 10 years at minimum until it's like optimum drinking time.
Yeah.
Then cellar it yourself and release it when you think it's right. That's the one quarrel I have with it. Is like people need to be like, stand behind what you believe. And if you're willing to do that, I know people like don't want to tie up their capital for 10 years, vintage upon vintage, like they need cash flow. I get the business part of it, but at the same time, it's like if you truly believe in that, then that's what you should do. You should strive to do that, or at least hold back some of your production. Like we'll hold back a couple hundred cases of certain productions of ours. Like this is going to be a cellar release.
Yeah.
Like when I know that the 2014 is completely gone out of the market, right? Like it's out of our warehouse. The distributors don't have any inventory of it, and we know that there's none on the shelf, and it's mostly been consumed. There might be a small percentage of people who have cellared some of that for a long period of time, or planning to for a long period of time, but the vast majority of people aren't going to do that. So at some point here in like the next, I'd give it like 2 years, we're probably going to start doing some cellar releases just to show people like this is what a 2014 and 2015 vintage looks like with, say, 10 years of age on it.
Sweet.
And Taylor Lane was built, the whole thing was
That's
built
what I was going to say.
that.
Taylor Lane, is that how you built it that way?
Magnums only. Mags, they age better, and then we release it when it's ready. So, I mean, that's a fun project. Like, we had 2011 was our first vintage, and I don't want to say we skipped. We are holding the 2012 and 13 because those were ripe vintages, like, but they just weren't quite ready. So we're tasting through like the next vintages after the 11. Like, is there one that's ready to release right now? And the one that tasted like on point for us was the 2014. So we just released the 2014. So that's called like 7 to 8 years of bottle age. Probably about 2 years of barrel age before that. And the wine is like tasting beautifully. Now, in a year or 2 years' time, is it going to be, do we go back to the 2012 or the 13? Those two wines, they might not be released for, 20 years.
Yeah.
Pinot holds up great, though. Pinot's got good acid, good structure. So it definitely, it is an age-worthy wine. One of, if not the best, reds for age-worthiness.
Dude, nice. I mean, I think like that was a good thorough harvest update, man. Like, we've had this conversation where I think you like to have wine that's like it's ready to drink now. It's not this idea of like, holding on something. You also have some like you have wine that you've aged yourself.
Yeah.
To give people the opportunity, so when they get it, it's like this is ready for you to drink
now.
Whether it's Taylor Lane, and it's been aged for 8
plus years. Yeah,
8+ years.
Same like Quilt Reserve, the Grace of the Land, like that. That's we're just about to release the 2018 vintage, and it's 2023.
Yeah,
that spent probably 2.5 years in barrel, and then we bottled it, and then held it until like okay when it's ready. So there's got to be like intention behind certain wines. Now there are other wines. So think about it. Think about it this way. What is you have these levels, right? You have the wine, say the winemaker, wine company, whatever it is, and then you have the gatekeeper. And that gatekeeper is usually the buyer for a restaurant or a store. Yeah. And then you have the end user. Well, there are a number of different factors working here, because if I were to go to one of those, like the buyer for a store and say, hey, we're releasing our 2019 Pinot Noir, they're going to be like, that sounds like it's old. Like, my customers are expecting the 2021s to be out right now. Yeah. And you're like, well, we aged it in bottle. It's like, well, my customers don't understand that, and I don't have time to educate them on that. So then you're like, well, so then we want to keep up on current vintage. Basically, what is the rest of the winemaking community doing per varietal? So that's kind of like one of the factors. And another factor is, then you pull it back. Oh, there you go. I like that. That's a good aging chart.
So Art just brought up.
I want to see if I'm going to agree with this.
Yeah.
Let me finish my thought first. So keep that up, Art. So do you like do it super intentionally where you age it for such a long period of time where it hits its like prime and then release it?
Yeah.
Or do you say like on the front end is where we're going to release it, and or do you make your wines in a way such that they are acceptable and approachable on release, but also age-worthy? That's the hardest one. That's the hardest, and that's, I think, the best one. That's what we try to do, because you're going to enjoy the wines in, call it like you're going to enjoy the Pinot Noirs 12 to 18 months after they're harvested, and they're also going to age well. And that's what I prefer, but we also have vineyards that don't allow for that. We have vineyards that are specifically like in need of a very different process and in need of a very different timeline before they're released. Now, again, I've always said this, if you're a producer and you go out there and you say like, enjoy this wine, but if you buy it, you're going to buy it, you put it in your cellar for 10 years. You're like, why would I do that?
Yeah.
I mean, I might die in 8, and then my kids are going to sell the cellar or whatever. Like, so there's our society does want immediate gratification. That's part of it, which wine does deliver that. But if you have a wine that your wine buyer, your wine shop says like, oh yeah, that's an amazing wine, but you're going to have to wait 8 years. They're going to be like, I don't want to pay $200 for something I got to wait 8 years on. So I'm going to go with something that's more readily and accessible right now from a style perspective. So there's a lot of like balance and thought that's got to go into whatever it is the product is you're making and what you want to achieve from that, and what interaction you want the end user to have with that. And I do think that that aging wine can be a hobby. I think if you're in it for a hobby, then you're good. Most people don't look at it as a hobby though. Most people are like, I'm at the store right now. I'm going to make whatever steak and chimichurri, and I need a couple bottles of wine for that. So it's like pick up like a couple bottles of Pinot or whatever, and you enjoy them that night. So I don't know. It's like it's a funny double-edged sword about aging and what should be on the producer and what the consumer should expect. So that was that for aging. But do all wine varieties age the same? I think that's what we are going to be talking about right here. And this chart really has some solid shit.
I just want to say for the people that are just listening, Art found a good chart here by Wine Folly. And it's just reds, and it's an aging chart. And this is a good one for Joe, who's going to kind of look this over and see what he thinks about what they're saying, the different ranges of age that you should have for these certain varietals. So
I'm going to go with the main ones here first. So looking at Cabernet, now it depends, I think, partly on what region the Cabernet is from, and for that matter, Merlot as well, any of the Bordeaux varietals. But in this chart, they're saying that it is optimum between 5 and 20 years of age. Now, I'm assuming that they're talking about from the vintage, right?
Yes.
Okay, so... And then what, I don't know what that other line is there that shows like from 0 to 30 plus. So first of all, I don't like aged cab in general, whether that's from Bordeaux or from Napa or Paso or anything. I think that once you get to like, I mean, yeah, there are anomalies, but by and large, after like 10 years from vintage, I feel like the fruit dissipates so much that it just doesn't quite hold together. And Cabernet is naturally a pretty low acid variety, so it doesn't hold up. So I'd say that what you need to age a wine for long term is good acid, like firm acid. Like you got to feel it. It's got to be impactful, even on release. Like that wine's got to have a good searing acidity. So that just top to bottom right there, you got Cabernet, Merlot. They're both saying like up to 20 years. Nope, that's bullshit. Like I think 10 on. Then like there's nothing wrong with that. We make a lot of cab. I love cab, but I can tell you that it doesn't taste as good after, like, in general, after 10 years of age.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, Syrah is interesting because Syrah, Grenache, let's toss a few of these. Well, there's no other ones on the list, but let's say Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedre, some of the Rhone varietals. Those are some of the best aging reds I've ever seen. And look, they only put it out there for like 3 to 15 years for both Syrah and Grenache. I mean, some of my favorite aged wines, like 30, 40 years, are from the Rhone, and they're either Syrah or Grenache based. And so again, like you could make a really sappy, rich, like really ripe Syrah here in California. That's gonna hold up like a cab. Or you can be more in a coastal environment, or you can be in the Rhone Valley. where it's a little bit cooler and you're going to have higher acidity, and those wines are going to age out. And like, I mean, I'm not kidding. Some of my favorite wines I've ever had are like, 30, 40-year-old Rhone reds. Now, Pinot Noir, let's get to the coup de grace, the main point here, because I think, and this is we're just talking about reds right now, because whites are a whole different thing. I think Pinot Noir is one of the best aging wines. I'd say it contends, maybe takes second place to the Rhone varietals.
For aging,
yeah. But, I mean, I've had some phenomenal Pinots that are, going on 50 years, and they don't look good. Like, I remember this one. It was like a 68. This is one of the more recent ones. A 1968 Carneros from 1968. That's Napa Valley. Like, Napa Valley wasn't even on the map. But Beaulieu Vineyards was making some great wines back then. I mean, and so this thing, like, poured it in the glass, and it was brick, like brown in color, right? And so you're like, and it's super thin looking, like you could see right through it, which happens with it long-term aging. So I'm swirling it, looking at it, and just like thinking, I'm going to be disappointed.
Yeah.
And I smelled it, and it was fucking beautiful. Tasted it, it was amazing. And I'm just like, this is a testament. Like, this is one of those wines where it's like, this is fucking great. Like, and it's going to hold up for even longer. So I think that, and again, Pinot Noir just naturally in these cool areas, whether it's Carneros, the Sonoma Coast, or really Oregon, I mean, wherever we grow our grapes too, it's cool areas that maintain the natural acidity in the fruit. And so that acidity is what's going to really hold the vibrancy in that wine for the long term. So I don't agree with this chart at all. Wine Folly did this.
But you bring up an important point, which is with that wine that you tasted. So the look of it, if you wouldn't have tasted it, you would have had a totally different feeling of. I mean, you looked at it, you didn't think it was going to taste that great, and you were actually pleasantly surprised. It sounds.
Yeah, very much.
So when it comes to like the aging process, if you're going to taste something that's been aged like for 10 years or 20 years, I mean, that one, would you say that was from the 60s?
Yeah, like 68.
So 68. Is that something that you can think about when you're drinking this like really aged wine, that the look of it can be deceiving? That like you're really gonna maybe have to really kind of jump in there and taste it and see.
Yeah, I think no matter just hold no kind of preconceived notion, and don't be convinced by any of your senses that it's going to be bad until you try it. So you're going to assess it, and like if I were writing tasting notes for that, I'd mark it down. Not that I mark down I wouldn't mark score down, but it would look like the opening of that tasting note would be like brown brick hue, very clear. Like it wouldn't. That's not a positive, right?
Yeah.
But then I've also had some wines where they're a couple years in bottle. You swirl them around, they're just inky and beautiful and dark, and they got this bright, like, fuchsia hue, and like, you're like, oh, this is going to be great, and it could be one of the most garbage wines you've ever had. So it's like, you don't judge a book by its cover, don't judge a wine by its color. It's hard to say that, because I do generally like to think that like the darker wines, at least in their youth, generally are going to have a little more impact, and they generally do. So
wait, for that, and just really quick though, like, so the look. But then what about the smell? Are you able to pick up on the nose that it's going to be better? With that
yeah. You'll like usually flavors follow aromatics, right? You're actually tasting through your olfactory.
Yeah.
You're tasting like when you taste, it's coming. It's actually part of your perception of aromatics more than it is about taste buds on your tongue. When you're tasting, that's the way the wheels fall off in tasting is the profile, the phenolic profile, the textural elements of the wine and the acidity in the wine. Like, is that balanced? So you may get great aromas and be like, oh, I'm in for a treat, and then taste it and be like, that's fucking tannic and high acid, like super tight. I don't like how that plays on my palate.
Yeah.
Or it might be, I don't really like the aromatics, and you might not really like the flavor, but it has a beautiful gracefulness on the palate. So every wine is different. It's all about just experience and learning about what you like. And so to do that, you just got to try a whole plethora of wines, and different wines from different regions and from different vintages. And you kind of just get you got to create your own bearing on what you like, I think is what I'd tell people. Like, get out there and experiment and have some fun, because there's a whole lot of shit to try, and a lot of it's not that expensive. You don't need to start with like $50 bottles or $100 bottles. You can find stuff that's, $10. Actually, I don't know if grocery outlet is everywhere, but grocery outlet is, if you go and like, we don't do much with them because they're kind of like, they buy like stuff that's just not moving, right? So they're always just looking for a deal.
Mm-hmm.
But there's one in Napa, and if you walk in there, like, they've got all of these imported wines that, like, you don't really know anything about, but you're like, oh, I'm going to try it for $6 or $10 a bottle, and you might try it and be like, that was really good. Well, like, what was the problem? Maybe it's not the quality of the wine. Maybe it's the marketing. Maybe it's that they don't have anybody here, or they don't have an importer or a distributor here that's actually doing their job. They just put it in the barn, and then they're like, hey, we got to come up with some capital, move this shit out at like just above cost, and then that goes to a place like grocery outlet who's buying it at the bottom of the pricing model that the distributor has, and then they're just barely upcharging it, so the consumer gets this opportunity. That's a great place to go to really try some stuff. And I gotta say, like, grocery outlet, like, they're known as kind of like the low end, one of the low end discounters for like groceries. They got like pretty good stuff. I mean, it's fun to explore their wine section, and it changes all the time.
Yeah.
Because they don't have they're not doing programs with people. They're not doing like, oh yeah, we always want to have this product on the shelf. It's like, well, what's cheap? What's being closed out from these distributorships, and they'll jump in. It's pretty good.
I think that's a good part for the education part of it too, for people to go out there and kind of follow that.
That's it. Without like
little game plan,
breaking the bank, like get out there, like,
and taste
like,
a lot. Just
buy 5 bottles and open them all up with like a couple friends one night and taste through them and be like. And that's another thing I'd say for people to learn. If you can get like verticals with some separation, so like, 5 years in between each, and that's pretty hard to do. But if you could take like the same wine but 5 years in between each of the bottles that you're tasting, then you really get to see how age affects wine. And the other thing is, if you're experimenting and you're like, I want to go out and try some like Rhone or Rhone varietal wines, and you go to a place like Grocery Outlet and you buy those 5 bottles of all, say, Syrah or Syrah Grenache, Mourvedre blends, whatever they are, bring them home and try them out, and then you get to see the differences stylistically and whatever else at a reasonable price. But like, everybody tastes wine and thinks like, oh, there's not like all that great of like, memory to what that exact wine was. I mean, some people have that talent, but overall, you're looking at it like you need a comparative. You need like points of reference while you're tasting through. So it's not just like, oh, I had this one bottle of, let's say it's like Belglas Clark and Telephone Pinot Noir, and I loved it. It's like, I'm glad you liked it. Was there a reference point? Like, did you liked it as compared to what? And when you're tasting them in a lineup of different wines, that's when you really get to say like, okay, what is it that I like about this more than these other 4 wines?
Yeah.
And that's when people really start to open their minds up on wine. And I'd recommend doing that, like, I mean, once a week.
Well, yeah, dude, I think that's part of like the educational part of it. You have to dive in and actually taste it yourself and get into it. I want to just like do this for people because I know that they're into it. So real quick, just to kind of summarize and go through, Cab, what's your recommendation on aging?
Yeah. Sorry, we didn't even get the details. Okay, Cab, my recommendation is about 5. This is personal preference, by the way.
Yeah,
okay.
Personal preference. Go with your palate. Don't freak out. So if you're listening, maybe you want to know.
So I'm gonna say 5 to 8 years is like when I think it's really hitting best.
Okay.
And some of this comes from the lens of like my personal preference of my wines and the style of my wine, or the other wines that are out there in that similar style. Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir is interesting because it really doesn't have much to soften out. So like I'd say from release in general, unless there's certain circumstances, from release up to 10 years.
Yeah.
And I think you start going past 10, and again, dissipation of fruit can occur.
And that's what you said. I think you made that point before, that also with the go with your palate idea of this while you're going through these years, for people to know, is that it's also what people are like, what their palate is really used to. So the aging process, that you're going to get more towards that floral. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Like you said this really like great one time.
I would call it we call it bottle bouquet.
Bottle bouquet.
But it's not really floral. Like, yeah, you will get some of that, but it's like more like dried.
Okay.
Foliage, so like forest floor, so it could be a dry, like, I mean, and I like to get specific with our tasting notes. So like,
Yeah.
think of like, it's a hot, dry fall in Napa Valley, and you're walking through the oaks, and those valley oaks are dropping their leaves, and so it's like that dry, kind of like grainy, dusty sort of character.
Yeah.
But then you've also got the forest floor of like, say you're in the Pacific Northwest and you're walking through redwoods, and you've got that dampness underneath you. You've got ferns around, and it's like this real kind of like lively, deep, dense, rich, earthy character that comes out of that. So like there's different elements to it, I guess, but like that's where aged wines generally migrate in my mind, is to kind of one of those paths.
Dude, you're a poet and don't even know it. Jeez.